Do you dream of a world where art might be taught, funded, and distributed better than it is today? Well, I certainly do, and because I know you're probably both curious and busy, I'd like to continue to read out loud, parse and paraphrase and comment on an essay that is addressing these questions more directly than any other contemporary essay that I've been able to find so far. My name is Nika Dubrovsky. I'm currently an opera singer turned experimental performer with way too much background in literary criticism, which helps me parse texts such as the one I'm about to read to you. Another Art World was written by David Graeber, best-selling author of Bullshit Jobs and Debt, The First 5,000 Years, and artist Nika Dubrovsky. You can find a link to the first installment of my reading this essay in the show notes, though I actually think this installment will also make sense on its own. This part of the essay lays out a hypothesis about how post-industrial ideas of production, as well as ideas embedded in Western thought as far back as Greek myth and the Bible, unfairly legitimize the existence of curators, art dealers, and art administrators who safeguard the one rule that can't be broken within the art establishment. Oh, and that faux experimental boundary-pushing posture of contemporary art? They argue it's not a bug but a feature, one that benefits those who most profit from art dealing. Another Art World was meant as a kind of academic conversation starter. So start a conversation about the topics in this essay, be it with fellow artists in real life or with me, through whatever medium you like. So with no further ado, let's parse the second installment of Another Art World together. So, Another Art World Part 2, Utopia of Freedom as a Market Value by Nika Dubrovsky and David Graeber. The Endless Cycle of Production. The Romantic legacy has by no means disappeared from the contemporary art world. It's just retained only its most elitist elements. We still worship the individual genius, mad, tortured, or otherwise. What has been purged is any explicit belief that we all begin as artists and could, in a future society in which forms of institutional violence are rooted out, become artists once again. As a result, that very conception of freedom that once drove the various avant-gardes has come to regulate a logic of commoditization. Or even more, it has encouraged us to see that logic of commoditization as the definition of freedom itself. As a result of the fact that we have lost this idea of ourselves as children, and as artists, therefore, that very conception of freedom that once drove the various avant-gardes, right? All those avant-gardes that wrote all those manifestos in the 20th century, the Dadaists and the like, has come to regulate a logic of commoditization. Or even more, it has encouraged us to see that logic of commoditization as the definition of freedom itself. So basically they're saying that that logic of freedom, which originally was this idea of the freedom to return to one's own genius and therefore one's own self as an artist, was suppressed in favor or maybe transformed into this free market freedom. In the previous installment of this essay, we recalled that the Russian revolutionary avant-garde imagined people of the future, budetlians. I'm confused by the S at the end of that, because that's not how, I don't think that's how you make plurals in Russian. Budetlians were not only to be liberated from those unfair and malicious social conditions that stifled their creativity, they would also enjoy a kind of almost childlike freedom. This was a direct invocation of the original Romantic conception, born together with the concept of, quote, culture itself, one explicitly formulated in reaction to the logic of commoditization. This is, to me, quite novel, this idea that Romanticism, which, you know, is like this 19th century, we think of it almost as like a very decadent aesthetic and a decadent movement, was in fact the root of communist thought. And that a lot of the idea of the communist revolution was this idea that we would return to our childlike selves and our childlike freedom and enjoy that childlike freedom, which is fundamentally, in this conception, creative. Interesting. It would take a great deal of work to unravel how all this turned around, But the key, it seems to us, is to return to Comte and Saint-Simon's focus on industrialism. That, again, comes from the previous essay. If you want to know more about that, that's like the last third of the essay, is about the Romantics and the French Revolution, and how they decided to settle on artists as replacements for like the church, the new priests. The Romantic conception of the artist as isolated genius emerged, of course, at roughly the same time as the Industrial Revolution. Isn't that interesting? This was almost certainly no coincidence. As French sociologist Alain Quelle has suggested, the artistic genius might best be conceived as a kind of structural complement to the factory system. I really want to know how. In effect, the artistic genius is the older figure of the craftsman or artisan split in two. So this idea that before you had the great artistic genius, which is kind of a trope that we're living with to this day, before that you have only the craftsman or artisan. Artists were not some special creatures who were plugged into some other realm or something. They were simply technicians, craftsmen. Consumers were confronted with two different sorts of commodity. On the one hand, an endless outpouring of consumer goods produced by a faceless mass of industrial workers, about whose individual biographies consumers knew absolutely nothing, often not even what countries they lived in, languages they spoke, whether they were men, women, or children. On the other, unique works of art about whose producers the consumer knew absolutely everything, and whose biographies were an intrinsic part of the value of the objects themselves. Yeah, isn't that interesting? I guess it's hard for us today to imagine how strange it is that how many things we consume and buy that we have no idea about how they were made, who made them, who even put them on the shelf, right? You no longer have your local cheese artisan or whatever, whom you know by name and you know, who sells you their cheese. And then you have the artist who is known to a superfluous extent. But if the heroic figure of the artist is simply the mirror of industrialism, this would certainly help explain why that figure was so appealing to socialists like Saint-Simon or Marx, who in his student years tried his hand at Romantic poetry. It does not explain why this figure is still with us. After all, we live in an age when capitalism is more and more organized around the management, not of industrial labor, but care work, less about the creation than about the sustaining, maintaining, nurturance, education, and repair of people, things, and the natural environment. This is probably connected to a quote associated with David Graeber, one of the authors, that a cup is made once, but it's washed 1,000 times or something like that. Our economy is no longer as much organized around this creation of objects and more around the maintenance around them, and especially the maintenance of people. This is also significant in relation to the Museum of Care, which David Graeber and Nika Dubrovsky, the authors, founded together, and which Nika Dubrovsky now runs. You can hear a little bit more about that in my interview with her. But the whole idea of care work is, I think I can kind of see it like emerging now in academia, and I don't know that a lot of very like clear things honestly have been said about it, but care is a really interesting and important concept right now, I think. Even the main loci of class struggle centers on nurses, cleaners, class struggle today, that is, centers on nurses, cleaners, teachers, and care workers of various sorts. True, artists too less and less resemble industrial workers, and more resemble managers. But they are still heroic, highly individualized managers nonetheless. That is, the successful ones. The lesser figures are now relegated largely to the artistic equivalent of care work. I mean, there's a small percentage that's kind of lionized. The rest of us are kind of relegated to something like care work, kind of undervalued, a lot of assumption of it being free, you know? And it's telling that whatever else may change, and however much the romantic conception of the artist now seems to us trite, silly, and long since abandoned, however much discussion, for that matter, there is about artistic collectives, at a show like the Venice Biennale, remember, they started describing the atmosphere at the Venice Biennale in the first part, or a museum of contemporary art of any sort, almost everything is still treated as if it springs from the brain of a specific named individual. Perhaps one piece in 100 is an exception. And this is true no matter what the circumstances of a work's actual creation. We may be too delicate nowadays to call these individuals, quote, geniuses. But the entire apparatus of the art world makes no sense unless it's ultimately something very like what used to be called genius, something ineffable, spiritual, creative, and rooted in the individual's soul, which creates the value that it celebrates. So they're basically just supporting their point that the art world could not exist without this idea of the artists who create the work within as being somehow special. I think that would be the easiest way to put it. Even the fascination of the contemporary art scene with promoting works by artists identified with specific disadvantaged groups, Iraqi migrants, queer Latinas, and so forth, is perfectly apiece with this. It might seem to mark a return to something at least a little more like the older idea of collective cultural creativity, since the artists are being valued as representatives of the creative context from which they emerged. But ultimately, it simply dissolves that horizontal romanticism back into vertical, heroic romanticism again, since the value of any given artwork is still seen to derive from the artist's entirely individual biography, which quickly takes on a logic and trajectory entirely its own. I think that this is basically saying what I was saying in my reading of the first part of this essay, which is that the fact that Bob Dylan got the Nobel Prize and Kendrick Lamar got the Pulitzer Prize doesn't actually change that much about those institutions. The next paragraph is all in parentheses. So parenthesis, it's easy to see why this would have to be the case. To do otherwise would be to suggest that queer artists or artists of color are somehow less individually responsible for their works than straight white ones. That would be obviously bigoted or racist. The only alternative would be to treat the latter primarily as products of their cultural environment, which is precisely what the art world refuses to do. So I think that was just an aside to make clear to the reader that the authors of this essay are not saying that we should reduce artists that are not straight, white, cis males to their identity. But I guess that the only alternative would be to also reduce white male ones to their identity. The fact that everyone knows this does not make it any less true. Really, it just reveals how difficult this habit is to overcome, the habit of not changing the structure, but changing the people within it. Because the overwhelming majority of artworks remain, as they have always been since the Industrial Revolution, seen as making sense only in relation to some unique individual soul. An art world that was not organized around the creative vision of named individuals simply would not be an, quote, art world at all. So this is how academic prose works. This is just saying the same thing, but providing more and more support for it. This whole page, it's just been the art world could not exist as an art world without the idea of the individual artist as a genius. Why then the lingering power of industrial categories and industrial age modes of thought? The ultimate reason, it seems, that is not, they're saying industrial age, but they also mean romantic, okay? This is confusing because now they're using a different term, but what they mean is why does this romantic / industrial idea of the genius persist? The ultimate reason, it seems to us, lies in our inability to detach ourselves from the notion of, quote, production. We still seem obsessed with the notion that work is necessarily a matter of making things, preferably through a process that is simultaneously mysterious and at least a little bit unpleasant. Why, for example, do otherwise intelligent human beings so often insist that the, quote, working class no longer exist in wealthy countries, simply because not many people are employed in factories, as if it were somehow cyborgs or trained monkeys who are driving their taxis, installing their cable, or changing their bedpans when they're sick? Why do we identify work with, quote, production in the first place, rather than tending to things, maintaining them, or moving them around? So again, they're going back to this idea of producing things versus taking care of things. Basically, it's called care work, service work, right? I don't perceive this gap in people's knowledge. I've never heard anyone deny that there is a working class in the West. I just have not, and I have not heard anyone deny that people who drive taxis or install cables are not the working class. This habit of thought goes far deeper than Romanticism. It is the product of the habit of thought of thinking of working class labor as producing things, as opposed to taking care of things or moving things. It is the product of a very particular theological tradition. The Judeo-Christian Islamic God created the world out of nothing. He is in fact somewhat unusual in having created the universe out of nothing. Most work with existing materials. Graeber is an anthropologist, so he would have studied world religions. I wonder if it's common for most gods to create the world out of something, whereas this Judeo-Christian Islamic God created it out of nothing. That's interesting. The human condition, as the story of the Garden of Eden, or for that matter Prometheus, makes clear, Prometheus being not from the Judeo-Christian Islamic tradition, although he is from like the Western tradition since it's a Greek myth, so I don't know, is punishment. So this idea of Promethean / Garden of Eden punishment, right? Those who disobey the creator and try to play God are cursed to continue to do exactly that, to create the means for their own existence, but to do so in a way that is also a form of pain and suffering. Adam is cursed to grow food by the sweat of his brow. Eve is simultaneously told that God will multiply her pains in labor, that is, in giving birth. But, you know, in the original, is labor also work? Is giving birth and working also synonymous like it is in English? Because that would kind of matter to this. I don't know. I feel like this is unfinished a little bit. We might consider this analogy for a moment. The real process of, quote, producing children, if you really want to use that word, involves not just an act of sex and 9 months of pregnancy, but a web of social relations involving years of nurture, support, education. Yet here that entire process disappears, collapsed into the one moment when a baby seems, especially to male onlookers, to just appear, fully formed, through a mysterious but painful process out of nowhere, much like the universe. That's interesting. This is the very paradigm of, quote, production, a word which literally means to bring forth or even push out. It's true that, you know, like French, a lot of Latinate languages have produce, some form of produce. Even in Czech, we have this as a borrowed word, though we use it less. The factory was always conceived as the ultimate black box, a mysterious place of pain and suffering, where steel saucers or microchips somehow pop out fully formed through a process we'll never really know and would rather prefer not to have to think about. But so, in the classical conception, is the artist's brain. Okay, well, what it makes me think is like, that's a really cool idea, you know, connecting these things, you know, connecting Genesis to birth, to the factory, to the artist's brain. And I get the argumentation, but it's like, to me, it walks the line between like some kind of personal essay or like a more of a loose meditation, like an essay really in the French sense. Essayer is just to try something. And originally, you know, the conception of the French essay is not really to be objective. It's to play around with an idea and try something, make attempts on the page. And it seems like Graeber and Nika Dubrovsky have gone in that direction here. But it's utterly appropriate because they're working so much with French thought, right? In this light, it only makes sense that both the factory worker and the artistic genius must suffer. They simply suffer in opposite yet complementary ways. The factory worker suffers because he's alienated from his work. It means nothing to him, and he has no control over it. The artist, because she's hopelessly entangled in it and will never be able to break free. So this is going back to that thing that they said way back, that the artisan and the craftsman, which used to be just one person, one kind of person, the artisan and the craftsman. With the Industrial Revolution, it split into two. And you had the factory worker, fully anonymous, alienated from labor. And then you had the artist, who was utterly known and utterly enmeshed with their work. It's an interesting line of associations, but I struggle to distinguish this from like something like a personal essay or more, you know, that kind of essay rather than a truly academic, scholarly attempt at something. Obviously, with the decline of the importance of factory labor and the predominance of finance capital, the notion that work is primarily a matter of producing things instead of cleaning, moving, maintaining, nurturing, fixing, transforming, or caring for them, again, back to that theme, becomes ever more difficult to maintain. But in this context, the artist actually plays an increasingly strategic role. So they're actually saying that the artist, the position of the artist in this society that we have today is a kind of pawn for, and I guess they're going to explain this, art is still conceived as a factory of endless productivity, and art is still seen as somehow popping through a painful yet mysterious process, like birth, directly from the artist's brain. And with the art world sitting, as it does, at the peak of, quote, creative industries, does it though? I think that they are talking about just like the visual arts world. To me, from where I stand as a performer, I don't think that the art world stands above all of the arts, but maybe they know something I don't. And with the art world sitting, as it does, at the peak of the, quote, creative industries, all this works to subtly suggest that the administrators and bureaucrats who increasingly make it up really are somehow, quote, producing something after all, or something other than the various social tissues of the hierarchical structures of the art world itself. This is very kind of a ethereal, ephemeral, metaphysical argumentation. It's arguing about how we think, which is always a bit dangerous, I think, because how much of this is projection, how much of this is reality, how do you even measure this, my analytical brain kind of explodes. But I'm also very used to this kind of thinking because I hold an English degree, and David Graeber, one of the authors, is an anthropologist, but clearly he's also capable of writing stuff which is more akin to what I thought of when I was studying English, reading tea leaves. And that's why I wanted to study music more so than English. Anyway, let's move on to the next section. The art world in and out, that is the next section. Each exhibition, each new biennale or documenta strives and inevitably claims to be a historic event. Historical events are, by one definition at least, the one we like, precisely those events that could not have been predicted before they happened. Right. How can you plan for it to be historic? Every artistic event thus sets out to surprise its audience. Something must be formally new. Something must be included that was not previously considered to fit in the category of, quote, contemporary art, or even better, that was not considered to be an art at all. It's considered normal nowadays for exhibitions to include anything from ethnographic objects and folk art to the description of social practices or items of design. The art world constantly tests and weaves its boundaries. To some degree, this is what the art world has actually become. The constant testing and overcoming of its own boundaries. So this is something that I constantly ask myself, and this might be part of the answer, what they're about to explain. Like, what is it about experimentation that it's become so intrinsic to how we think of being an artist? An artist is supposed to be cutting edge. An artist is supposed to be experimenting. An artist is supposed to be pushing new boundaries. And we kind of, I think it's almost taken for granted today in a certain part of the world, of the art world. And frankly, I am part of that. I mean, I've worked, it's interesting because they talk so much about the art world as the visual art world. Some of the projects I've done recently as an experimental singer have been with galleries. And it's true that galleries are more open to doing multimedia stuff and collaborations between different art forms. Which sounds really like kind of almost democratic or something, but yet it's true. Like that, there's this falseness there that I keep being confronted by and that I keep thinking about. And I think that they will talk about this. As a result, it always appears to be moving in the direction foreseen by avant-gardes, bursting its own bubble in order to ultimately encompass everything. But can it really succeed in blowing itself up? Is it even really trying? Yeah, this is perfect. This is perfect because there's constantly this posture of, oh, we are breaking boundaries. We are taking down the artistic system. And are they? Like, is the art world doing that? Really? When a few years ago, someone asked Boris Groys whether the art world, always in crisis, was really on the verge of self-destruction, Groys answered, I do not see any signs of collapse. Worldwide, the industrial museum complex is growing. The pace of cultural tourism is increasing. New biennales and exhibitions are opening everywhere on a weekly basis. The recent edition of China alone has drastically increased the size of the art world. And so, from my perspective as an individual artist, and I am, at this point, I guess, multimedia, so I have also worked with and in galleries. It is fascinating that on the one hand, it can be a true statement, and this article was written in 2019, so quite recently. It is still a true statement that the arts industrial complex is nowhere near collapse, that there are more and more biennales opening up on a weekly basis, supposedly. But when you look at the life of the individual artist, you would not know it. Not really. This is why I wanted to read this essay to you, because this is what they're talking about, this irony of the institution versus the individual artist. Much of what is called the art world consists of an endless speculation on the rules, which are always in flux and under negotiation. This is maybe harkens back a little bit to what they were saying about the millionaires and their yachts, that basically the art world, that is specifically the gallery kind of world, that is the world of art that is a physical object, does operate on the notion of finance capital. No one claims to be responsible for these rules. Everyone claims they are just trying to figure them out. It becomes all the more complicated because exposing, challenging, or breaking the rules is now the main substance of art itself. I mean, they're describing an absurd situation, right? This game of making a spectacular show of violating the rules so as to create even more highly paid work for those who recalibrate, redistribute, and reevaluate them is hardly limited to the art world, incidentally. Increasingly, it is the basic substance of politics itself. Consider Brexit. While presented as an outburst of popular rage, of burn-it-all-down revolution against administrative elites, the class of people who are going to benefit the most from Brexit will obviously be lawyers, who will now have untold thousands of £1,000-an-hour work thrown at them, reevaluating pretty much every contractual agreement the UK has entered into from the last 40-odd years. In many ways, it stands as a parable for our times. Interesting. Still, there are always meta-rules, if we can call them that. Rules about what sort of rules can and can't be broken. Perhaps the best way to determine these is to determine what's clearly an invalid move. It's commonplace to hear, for example, that there's nothing nowadays that cannot be turned into a work of art. If only because the very act of arguing about whether or not something is art will itself tend to constitute it as such. But this isn't really true. Some things can't be turned into works of art. It is, as we've learned from the Venice Biennale, possible to dredge up a ship in which refugees have drowned in the Mediterranean and place it on display, and some will agree that this is an artistic gesture. But the refugees themselves, or the ocean in which they drowned, are quite another matter. You cannot, I suppose, display dead bodies as art. You can display them as science, but I suppose not as art. But look, whenever someone says this, I'm like, you know what? Someone's going to find a way. To put it another way, the continued embrace of one half of the romantic ideal is premised on the absolute exclusion of the other one. They're referencing basically all the way back to the first paragraph of the first part of this 3-part essay, where they said that there's this paradox that on the one hand, a certain aspect of the romantic ideal dictates that everyone is an artist, that is, that we're all children, ultimately, and that we're educated out of our childlike artistic genius. And the other half is the kind of the post-industrialist emergence of the idea, the romantic idea of the individual artist as genius. So they keep talking about that contradiction of embracing one aspect of romantic thought and not the other. If there's one absolute rule, one red line that cannot be crossed in contemporary art, they say, it is that everyone cannot be an artist. The kind of value art creates must necessarily be based on exclusion. To actually realize the vision of Novalis, remember that's the early romantic thinker who said everyone has to be an artist, or for that matter Osip Brick or even Joseph Beuys, would mean to dissolve away the entire structure which makes, quote, the art world what it is, because it would destroy the entire mechanism through which it creates value. Yeah, so again, we're just coming back again and again to the same idea. And this is academic prose. It's for people who love saying the same thing in different ways and supporting it more and more and more from different sides, like they're building a house. But the grain here, over and over again, is just this idea. The art world cannot exist as it exists today without this idea that art can only be created by some people, basically. This is not just because any market must, as we note, operate on a principle of scarcity, and some sort of conception of spiritual genius seems the only way to justify the levels of scarcity that a market pumped quite so full of the profits of financialized derivatives requires. The art world has, since the Industrial Revolution, always been based on the idea that, quote, real art is priceless and rare. The way the avant-garde challenge to this principle has been absorbed and recuperated has been to add to this that its definition is also constantly shifting and unstable. They allow for the definition of art to be unstable, but they don't allow for the definition of the artist to be unstable, let's say. But this situation is in fact altogether favorable to the current players of the art market in the same way that market volatility is favorable to bond traders. The rapidly changing values of art objects, the discovery of the new names of artists, allow for ever new opportunities for profit, and especially for the insider traders who have some advanced knowledge of how the rules are about to change. In many cases, because they are involved in changing them themselves. Yeah, so what they're describing here is the volatility of the market, the fact that the idea of what art is constantly shifting, is actually strategic for people who are trying to make money off of this market, right? Because if you purchase something before it's in at a low price, you can make lots of money off of it by reselling it when it is suddenly in. And they claim that the same people who are making the rules are also the ones profiting off of those changing rules. This is what the work of gallerists and curators is basically about. The price spikes, the conceptual revolutions, the new discoveries, the constant gladiatorial clashes between artists, galleries, curators, critics, all combine to propose a subtle argument that the characteristic logic of financial markets, the combination of creative destruction, self-marketing, and speculation, is freedom. Indeed, freedom on the most refined spiritual level. After all, it is nothing if not exhilarating. It feels like a game where anything goes. But so often does the financialized peaks of the business world. And just as in the business world, all this is only possible against the unstated background of that which absolutely cannot be challenged, which are ultimately structures of exclusion. So basically, they've just, from all sides, almost all possible sides, or at least a plenitude of sides, have supported this idea that the art world can only exist if you deny the idea that everyone is an artist, if you create artificial scarcity, let's say. They haven't used that term yet, but I think they do use it elsewhere. And so it is a structure of exclusion that operates just like they would claim markets operate on artificial scarcity. So the next section is called We Don't Wish to End Here, However, or Art Communism 2. Our conclusions might seem bleak. Art remains inseparable from romantic notions of freedom. But the pursuit of the individual version of romantic freedom seems to lead inexorably to validating the logic of finance capital, just as the pursuit of the collective democratic version of romantic freedom in which art is free to all leads, if Tsvetan Todorov and company are to be believed, inexorably to the Gulag. So they're just saying that the romantic ideals of freedom, which have their roots in this idea that everyone is an artist, that we are these innately free creatures, has been transformed into this free market capital freedom. It's very confusing, actually, because they talk about two different romantic freedoms. That's their whole point, is that there was this split of the idea of childlike romantic freedom and then the freedom of finance capital, which came later. So just as the pursuit of the collective democratic version of romantic freedom in which art is free to all leads, if Tsvetan Todorov and company are to be believed, Tsvetan Todorov, I looked this up, is a historian, philosopher, structural literary critic, sociologist, and essayist. So if Tsvetan Todorov and company are to believe, then the idea of the childlike freedom that in which everyone is an artist inexorably leads to the Gulag. But we don't think things are really as bad as all that. In fact, since the logic of finance capital is not ultimately particularly inspiring, it only operates because the lure of communism as the ultimate realization of Novalis' dream of undoing the violence that destroys our sense of play, beauty, and creation, that romantic idea of childhood, continues to unfold it. What I think, according to even their description, what's going on, it's that the roots of our, let's say, Western culture are in romanticism, and that this romanticism simply split into different directions at some point. One of those directions was kind of the communist revolution direction. Another one was the individualist, genius mind, which in some ways is the finance capital dream, this idea of the survival of the fittest genius or something. Here we have to take issue with Todorov's otherwise brilliant essay, Avant-Gardes and Totalitarianism, where he warned that the romantic element in the avant-garde always turned out to open the way to totalitarianism. Citing numerous quotes from Stalin, Hitler, and Mussolini, Todorov argues that 20th century dictators typically enacted the visions of avant-garde artists, that of radically transforming our common reality in accordance with some master plan. If poetry could no longer be written after Auschwitz, as Theodor Adorno famously said, it was only because poetry was complicit in the crime. So what they say he argues is that dictators, these big dictators of the 20th century, were actually drawing on or enacting avant-garde visions of radically transforming our common reality, which to me seems like a stretch, but I'm sure, he provided some kind of support for that. So I guess they're saying that according to Todorov, that would mean that if poetry could no longer be written after Auschwitz, then it was because it was complicit in the crime. I don't know if they're making fun of that notion, because I don't think that that's what Adorno meant there. But I guess they're saying that according to that logic, Todorov would be saying that it's because poetry was complicit in the crime of the Holocaust. Perhaps it's understandable then that the second half of the 20th century came to be defined by a determination to entirely eliminate poetry from politics, to turn over power first to bland technocrats, then to even blander managers whose visions, insofar as they had one, was precisely not to have one. But the financial crisis of 2008, and particularly the looming crisis of climate change, which threatens to kill far more humans than all the wars of the 20th century combined, has demonstrated that the rule of managers and technocrats is likely even more dangerous still. I think what he's saying, given that Graeber was against bureaucracy, he has a whole book talking about the ridiculousness of bureaucracy. I think he was talking about how there's these dictators, these major leaders who had this power, and then we tried to put these systems in place, these bureaucratic systems in place, to keep that kind of leader from rising. But they're arguing here that actually these managers and technocrats who are now in place, these systems now in place to keep those sorts of rulers out, that they're even more dangerous. So I want to know how they make that argument that the bureaucracy is more dangerous than these dictatorships. The themes of the last Venice Biennale were devoted precisely to this sense of impeding catastrophe. The two most memorable pieces were a sunken refugee ship and the small, I guess that's the one that they mentioned before, and the small Lithuanian pavilion, a modestly sung ode to the end of the world. All reveled in the possibility of establishing a redemptive narrative. What, after all, were we, as spectators, being offered as answers? Or even in the way of participation in the debate? Nothing but endless queues and parties, benefits, tournaments, the prospect of ownership of some fragment of our impeding doom. They're talking about the ridiculousness of these art events in which these big subjects are approached. People can buy stuff if they have the money, but in fact, nothing is really being done in the way of debate, actually. Knowing a little bit about Nika Dubrovsky, I think she probably does believe in activist art. I am of the opinion that no, that art is something else, that it is not meant to be a manifesto. You can write manifestos. We all have moral opinions, and I think we all also have some moral imperatives. But I don't think that you can put on art, on the content of art, to actually be the activism. And in this case, the analysis of expert qualifications of artists and curators or assessments of the level of complexity and subtlety of any specific work is quite a meaningless exercise. We would like to imagine the possibility of a completely different model of the art world. It's sometimes remarked that even if a modest proportion of the mathematicians and software engineers currently engaged in designing technology for high-speed trading were to shift to working on trying to design alternatives to capital, we'd easily have at least the outlines of a dozen viable economic systems laid out in no time. What if we were to apply the same creativity we do to inventing new works of art, or for that matter, theories about the nature of art, to imagining different ways the institutional structure itself could be organized? What would art communism actually be like? We will dedicate the next chapter of our essay to these thoughts. So that's the end of part 2. I think it's a wonderful call to think about the structure of the art world as opposed to the stuff that's being made within it. I think, I'm doing something that's called artistic research right now in Lyon at the High Conservatory here, and it's very important to me. But I don't kid myself about the fact that it's important in any other way except artistic research. I'm doing research to see what can I do as an artist, and possibly what new things can I do that might inspire other artists to take it even further. But that's not activism. And that's why I have this podcast, because I don't think I can do activism through my art, but I can ask questions and have conversations outside of that and talk about the actual structures, economic or otherwise, surrounding how art is made and who makes it. And that's why I think the theme, let's say, of this essay is very important. Now, what I will point out here in this last paragraph is that they ask the question, what if we were to apply our imaginations to reimagining not just the nature of art, but imagining different ways the institutional structure itself could be organized? I'm on board with that. But then the next sentence is, what would art communism actually be like? So cool, art communism is one concept. It was tried. I think that they make some arguments in the third part about how it actually did work in many ways, art communism, in Russia at that time, before it was kind of squashed by the communist regime. But it's like, okay, so that's one idea that's been tried, but I think that, there's lots of other ones that we could also have, and maybe they wouldn't have the word communism in them. And I think they leave that open, and that's why I wanted to share it kind of more broadly and hopefully start a conversation between artists about this. I hope to get the third and final installment of this essay to you soon. After this more philosophical text, I hope to share more texts on art anthropology, economics, technology, etc. If you have suggestions for things to read, let me know. To keep up with the podcast, follow on Instagram or sign up for the newsletter. And of course, subscribe everywhere. Here's to being on the Verge.